First of all, welcome so much to Coffee and Tea with IWRC. My name is Stephanie Herman. I'm the membership coordinator. For those of you whose first time, just so you know, IWRC stands for the International Wildlife Rehab Council. We're a nonprofit that supports wildlife rehabbers and related professionals. And we do that through science-based education, publications, standards. Coffee and Tea are our monthly free seminars. And we offer these to support ongoing learning and connection between rehabbers and just awareness of what's going on out there in the world. There are so many of us doing so many things. Before we dive in, I have two pieces of business this week or this month to talk to you about. The first is that we are hosting a fundraiser this month to support the Helene Van Donnick Memorial Fund, which is a fund that gives out grants and scholarships to rehabilitators to support wildlife coexistence efforts. This is really topical for the work we're doing today and the conversation we're having today. Yeah, so if you're interested in donating to that, we do have a link for you that I'm going to just pop in the chat for you. And the other thing is that next month, for a little sneak peek as to what's happening next month, we're going to have another coffee and tea next month on managing wildlife hotlines. So kind of in line with some of the conversations we're having today, but this is going to be a panel of wildlife rehabilitators from around the world who answer the phones and emails and talk to the public about wildlife rescues, wildlife coexistence issues, and they're really going to dive in deep, both for advice around that and also for, what's awesome about the job, what's struggles about the job. So really, really hope to see you there. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe, and he's going to take it away. Joe is with Wildlife Health Australia, and he's here to talk to us today about ethical risk communication.
Wonderful news. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. And thank you to the International Wildlife Rehab Council for inviting me back. My name's Joe. I'm based in Australia. I will say a lot of what I'm talking about will be Australia relevant, but I think adaptable across multiple regions. But today I'm here to speak about ethical risk communication regarding wildlife, with a particular focus on how we can frame messages around wildlife health and risk, and when these conversations occur at the human-wildlife interface. And as I'm sure many of you experience every day, the skill set for wildlife rehabilitators goes far beyond the care of animals in the technical sense, and that includes ensuring we have strong communication skills and tools that can help to engage with the public around a lot of topics regarding wildlife. And today I'll be talking about ensuring we're prepared for our own benefit and for when members of the public inquire about risks associated with wildlife, with up-to-date and transparent information about the potential risks both to people and wildlife themselves. And that our messages are framed to ensure risk mitigation and prevention and public health advice is clear and accessible, but while also balancing this to avoid, where possible to correct, negative community attitudes around wildlife in these interactions or opportunities to discuss these topics. And part of the reason I wanted to discuss this topic is that in my own experience when discussing wildlife, when working in some places and with some communities, particularly in those that might not place a high value on wildlife or who may view wildlife primarily as pests, discussions about wildlife can often be met with irritation towards wildlife or aggression, especially around topics of disease or perceived risk. And we can get responses like, why don't we just get rid of them? And though we try our very best, these conversations have the potential to fuel negative attitudes towards wildlife, particularly where fear is already shaped by media or social media or long-held perceptions about some species and their reputation as being pests, and when speaking about the risk to people from wildlife. It's an important topic to consider as a trusted member of the community regarding wildlife, as people who may get asked about it frequently. And this talk's aimed at all wildlife health professionals, but with a focus on wildlife rehabilitators who are fielding inquiries from their local community and who are touch points of information regarding wildlife, like many of you out there are, and often will be the first to be contacted in rescue events locally. We do cover this in a later slide, but I just want to clarify up front that this is not advising to take public health advice into our own hands. And advice relating to public health is always best provided by the authorities, by the appropriate authorities. And we'll outline that a bit later in the talk as well. The risk communication I'm referring to here can support public health advice around public interactions with wildlife and general inquiries about species. that may be commonly reported or sometimes complained about by the public, and ensuring we have transparent and up-to-date information and resources to pass on while keeping the well-being of wildlife in mind as well. I'm going to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands that I live and work on, of the Gubbi Gubbi people here in southeast Queensland in Australia. I pay my respects to their ongoing relationships and continued connections to land, sea, and wildlife, and the importance of those connections to their communities. I also pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous peoples watching this talk today. So in the talk, we'll cover quite a bit of ground. It is a bit, I will try and keep it to time, but as I mentioned, it's at its core, the talk's about how we communicate about wildlife and risk, and how we do that accurately and honestly while being mindful not to enhance fear or negative attitudes towards wildlife. So ethical communication in this instance goes both toward the ethics of ensuring transparency about risk with the public, and also the ethics of how we frame messages to keep attitudes of wildlife from eroding through the language we use, how we represent wildlife in these discussions, and how we maintain trust as community members. I'm going to briefly revisit One Health and the role of wildlife rehabilitators within that, particularly your position at the interface between people, wildlife, and environmental health. And from there, we're going to look at risk communication from its foundations, including what it actually means and what it entails, and when these conversations occur, because you may already be having them more often than you might realize that you are. And I'm going to cover how we communicate appropriately to mitigate risk in a way that aligns with public health advice, while acknowledging the value of wildlife, not just in terms of their right to exist, but their role in healthy ecosystems. And I'm going to talk about the need to recognize when something moves beyond our scope, and when it's appropriate to refer to public health advice or trusted sources or relevant authorities. I'm also going to go through some of the challenges and learnings from my own experience discussing wildlife with the public over the years, and hopefully we can walk through why it's important as rehabbers to consider how we frame responses and how we approach these topics. And I'll share a range of tools and resources that are available that can help in how we frame these conversations or written communications. And ultimately, the aim is to highlight the value of your role in this space and how important you are in shaping how wildlife health and disease risk are understood in the community. So why am I the one talking about this? It's a great question. I have a fair bit of experience in communicating about wildlife to the community. I grew up in the Highlands in the high country in Victoria here in Australia, and was helping wildlife rehabilitators from a very young age, and took that love of the environment into a career where I originally wanted to be a nature documentarian and studied filmmaking and storytelling and worked as an underwater videographer for a time. But while working with scientists and ecologists, I realized I wanted to do what they were doing instead of watch what they were doing. So I began studying wildlife conservation wildlife and conservation biology. And I also started rescuing in urban environments while I was doing that. And I also have worked as a zoo presenter, delivering keeper talks and communicating the organization's conservation messages to hundreds of people a day. And I started working as a wildlife emergency response operator at a statewide level here in Australia, and eventually became supervisor of that and worked with a team answering tens of thousands of calls each year about wildlife in distress. And currently, I work at Wildlife Health Australia, as Stephanie mentioned. I'm the project officer in the International One Health program. But as part of that team, we're the managing team for the World Organization for Animal Health Collaborating Center for Wildlife Disease Risk Management. And I also coordinate the World Organization for Animal Health Pacific Wildlife Health Network. And very proudly, just recently, as of this year, become a board member of the IWRC. Very proud to be here. I've also done some training with the IUCN in wildlife disease risk analysis and facilitating species conservation planning. So, though I'm not a vet, I have worked in the wildlife space for some time and communicating with individuals and communities and internationally with a range of stakeholders around wildlife health and associated risks, and ensuring wildlife and those that care for them are considered within a One Health framework. And if you haven't heard of Wildlife Health Australia before, here in Australia, we're the national body advancing wildlife health for a healthier future for all. We're built on strong and trusted partnerships across Australia and beyond, and bringing together experts and governments and communities, including the wildlife rehabilitation community, to better understand and respond to wildlife health issues rather. And we're a non-government organisation, and we work with over 800 national and international stakeholders to build Australia's understanding of wildlife health in a One Health framework, including diseases, emerging risks, and the drivers behind them. So, excuse me. To understand the role of wildlife rehabilitators in communicating risk associated with wildlife, we first need to understand the concept of One Health and where wildlife health professionals sit within that space. I gave a talk to the IWRC last August on collaborating for One Health, including how we work, how this work's being done globally, and the role of wildlife rehabilitators within these projects. So if you'd like a deeper dive, I encourage you to do that. I will be giving you a lot of QR codes throughout this talk, so feel free to hit them up if you'd like. But for now, I'll give a brief overview of the One Health framework. And I am going to use a few slides from my previous presentation, so they look familiar. I do apologize, but I thought that'd be good to emphasize the fundamentals of One Health. So what do I mean when I say One Health? If it's not a term you've heard before, that's totally fine. But at its core, it's recognizing human health, animal health, both domestic and wildlife, and environmental health are interconnected and interdependent. And when I talk about interfaces, I mean where these areas of health, human, animal, and environmental, truly interconnect. So, for example, that's in wildlife rescue, it's in wildlife disease response, it's in public health response, and zoonotic spillovers. And a lot of the time, these interfaces are areas of high risk. And those working in wildlife rehabilitation and rescue, for those of you that do, that may seem quite obvious, but it's a critical concept, particularly when we're talking about communicating risk with the public about wildlife. And many diseases that affect humans and livestock often originate in animals and often in wildlife. And we're seeing these events occur more frequently, which is why the One Health approach is really important, not just responding to disease events, but preventing spillover and managing risks at these interfaces, which communication is a key part of. And it's also important to understand, though, that One Health isn't a single program or project that we just implement. It's a multidisciplinary framework and an ideology and a way of working. And for that to be effective, it has to be embedded in how we design the projects that we deliver in this space. And in practice, that's often guided by what's referred to as the 4Cs, which you can see here: communication, collaboration, coordination, and capacity building. And as the One Health concept has been further understood, it's been well recognized that certain human activities, such as expanding agriculture, urbanization, anthropogenic-induced climate shifts, and unregulated wildlife management, including wildlife trade, are increasing the human-wildlife interface. These practices bring humans and livestock into closer contact with wildlife and the systems that they occupy. They also increase demand on wildlife rescuers and rehabilitators who respond to wildlife health events. And at the same time, these pressures can alter and in many cases reduce the distribution of wildlife populations across a landscape. And this brings both intra-species and interspecies, so the same species or different species populations, closer together. And when that happens, pathogens can spread more rapidly and adapt, potentially becoming more harmful to wildlife themselves or more capable of spreading between species, including to humans. And these increasing trends of zoonotic disease spillover events have been compiled and reviewed in scientific literature for quite some time. These sources show that over the last few hundred years, around 70% of emerging infectious disease have originated from animals, and of those, more than half have come from wildlife. And it also shows that around 90% of emerging viruses are zoonotic, and roughly 2/3 of those were the result of spillover from wildlife. So these are, important facts to understand when working in the space between the human and wildlife interface that wildlife rehabilitators and other wildlife professionals occupy. And it's not to frighten anyone or exaggerate the situation. It's just important to understand and acknowledge that human-induced drivers are bringing wildlife and human systems closer together, and understanding the risks and the growing issues that surround these changes is an important part of being a trusted member of the community in wildlife. And how we navigate and communicate these risks for ourselves and the community is an important aspect of being a trusted point of information in the wildlife space. So just recapping One Health and your role within that, we, as people who work closely with wildlife, are working right at the intersection of human, animal, and environmental health, essentially at the center of the One Health framework, along with public health and environmental health colleagues and many other people who are involved. And as environmental conditions continue to change, we're seeing the human, wildlife, and wildlife livestock interfaces expand. And that means wildlife, people, and domestic animals are coming into closer proximity. And with that comes an increased potential for zoonotic spillover events. And as a result of these increasing interfaces, there's a growing demand on wildlife rescuers and rehabilitators who are operating at this intersection and frequently the first point of contact in wildlife health events, which is exactly why we have to consider our understanding of how to effectively discuss these risks, the tactics we use in our messaging around risk, and how we take a balanced and informed approach to ensuring we're mitigating these risks while framing these responses in a way that doesn't unfairly demonize or stigmatize or persecute wildlife in the process.